Here was a golden opportunity to turn the propaganda tables on the master of propaganda. Both letters appeared in the London Morning Chronicle of the 24th of November. By the end of the month they were printed in the French press as well, and Napoleon was the laughing-stock of Paris. In Cairo he turned to the problem of extinguishing the military menace from the Mamelukes. His forces caught up with Ibrahim Bey and defeated him heavily at Salali on August, but the French hold on Egypt was still tenuous. After a number of massacres of outlying French garrisons he was forced to send out more search and destroy missions. The main task, that of hunting down Murad Bey, was given to the brilliant Desaix, who had already settled well in Egypt and gathered around him a polyglot harem. On the 25th of August 1798 Desaix set out on an expedition which, in terms of sheer military brilliance, sustained month after month, equaled if not surpassed Napoleon's own great achievements. Time and again, often hugely outnumbered and usually with only 3,000 men at his disposal, Desaix defeated the Mamelukes, principally at El-Lakan, Samhud and Abnud. Meanwhile in Cairo Napoleon achieved his ambition of founding an Egyptian institute, with 4 sections: mathematics, physics, political economy, literature and the arts. At last the scientists and savants were coming into their own, for so far they had had a hard time of it, constantly the butt of derision from generals and privates alike. A roar of laughter invariably went up from the ranks just before an engagement when the cry was heard, "Donkeys and scientists to the center of the square." Now, though, they proved their worth and achieved things of permanent importance which echoed down the years long after the purely military exploits of Napoleon's army were forgotten. Together with the 9 local administrators the scientists supervised the building of hospitals, sewage systems, street lighting, irrigation schemes, windmills for grinding corn, a postal system, a stagecoach service, quarantine stations to combat bubonic plague, and many other projects. Since most of the scholars' books and instruments had been lost in the debacle at the Battle of the Nile, Comte, head of the Balloon Corps, built workshops to manufacture what was needed. Napoleon and Monge, president of the Egyptian Institute, supervised the construction of libraries and laboratories, the installation of a printing press, the beginnings of a geographical survey of Egypt, and complex mathematical studies of the pyramids. A red-letter day for the Institute came in July 1799 when they discussed the Rosetta Stone, brought back from Upper Egypt by the academicians who had accompanied Desaix's expedition. The paper read that day by Napoleon's principal Egyptologist later inspired the brilliant French linguist Jean-François Champollion to decipher the seemingly impenetrable hieroglyphics. Napoleon in person took a party of savants to survey the ancient Suez Canal and draw up plans for a new one. The amazing energy of the Egyptian Institute membership covered so much ground that their work needed several magisterial volumes to do it justice. These were published over 20 years and the final volume did not appear until R. 828. On the political front Napoleon tried to tighten his hold on Egypt by having his regime recognized as legitimate by the keepers of the Islamic flame. He approached the muftis at the Mosque of El-Azhar, a kind of theological university, for a fatwa declaring that the Muslim faithful should consent to his regime without infringing religious scruple. The muftis at first suggested that Napoleon and his army convert to Islam or at least be circumcised, and avoid alcohol. These terms were predictably perceived as too steep, and some hard bargaining ensued. Finally, a compromise was reached whereby, in return for complete non-interference with religious worship, the muftis issued a statement, confirmed from Mecca, that the French were allies of Islam and were exempt from the usual prescriptions concerning circumcision and teetotalism. This was a great and underrated propaganda victory by Napoleon, and without it he could scarcely have held down a country entirely hostile to him. But its effect was severely vitiated by lack of support from France. Although Napoleon in his letters to the Directory continued to harp on about the necessity that Talleyrand should depart urgently for Constantinople on his peace mission, it soon became obvious that Talleyrand was playing a double game of his own and had no intention of doing anything of the sort. Given the febrile state of Turkish emotions after the Battle of the Nile, only a top-level French diplomatic mission, prepared to make significant concessions, could have averted Turkey's drift into the British camp. When no attempt at all was made to extend an olive branch to the port, Turkey predictably declared war on France on the 9th of September, and the Sultan issued a firman declaring holy war on France. The long-term effects of the Battle of the Nile continued to eat away at Napoleon's position in Egypt. Not only was Turkey now hostile, trying to fan the flames of holy war against the infidel, but, because most of the bullion Brune and others had looted in Europe had gone to the bottom of the sea with El Orient, Napoleon had to raise taxes and exact forced loans to pay for the day-to-day administration, thus mathematically cutting down on the amount he and his army could hope to extract by looting. The resentment of taxation in turn fed into the religious crusade being preached from Constantinople. The resentment found expression in a great uprising in Cairo on the 21st of October, which demonstrated dramatically how shaky the French grip on the country was. Fanatical Muslims from the University of El-Azhar, sustained by dreams of immortality, took the French by surprise and slaughtered 250 Frenchmen before Napoleon was able to bring overwhelming force to bear. After 2 days of vicious and desperate fighting, he gained the upper hand, at a total cost of 300 Frenchmen dead and some 2,000 Arabs. Among the French casualties were General Dupuy and Napoleon's favorite aide-de-camp Captain Sulkowski. Despite the propaganda picture later painted by Guérin, Napoleon did not pardon the rebel ringleaders but executed them out of hand. What he did do, out of purely prudential motives, was to refrain from burning down the Mosque of El-Azhar, lest the entire country rise against him. But even this act of political judgment evoked complaints from the army, who had wanted to put Cairo to the torch in reprisal. Napoleon's position in Egypt was precarious and, cut off as he was in Egypt with no news of the outside world, worse than he knew, having intended to be absent from France for just a few months, he was now in limbo, not knowing how soon or if ever he could be reinforced. The recent revolt in Cairo showed how uncertain was the temper of the people, and he intuited that Nelson's naval victory would already have tempted the Turks to a declaration of war. He was not to know that the Directory had already effectively written him off and were concentrating on grave crises in Europe. The new confederations in Italy collapsed like a house of cards under a fresh Austrian assault. The indigenous rebellion in Ireland failed to coordinate with the French and ended ingloriously. Humbert eventually landed and won a string of small victories, but he was forced to capitulate. On the 4th of November, Talleyrand wrote to Napoleon to tell him he was on his own, and that if he could maintain himself there he had carte blanche, but this letter was not received until the 25th of March the following year. The last 2 months of 1798 were an ordeal for Bonaparte even without the depressing news from Europe. The British blockade was tight and morale in the ranks was crumbling. Battle, suicide and disease had already drastically reduced manpower, and in addition by the end of October 80% of the army was on the sick list. In December, bubonic plague broke out in Cairo, Alexandria and Damietta, claiming 17 victims a day on average and leaving behind a further 2,000 dead. It was not surprising that spirits were low even among the officers. Menu, Kleber, Dumas and even Berthier put in their resignations only to have them rejected. Reversing Sir Walter Scott's polarity, Napoleon's dreams of honor and of arms gave place to dreams of love and ladies' charms. Since he said farewell to Josephine in Toulon in May, he had been largely sexually inactive. An 11-year-old daughter of a sheikh named Zenab el-Bekri had been presented to him as a virgin prize, but he did not find the experience satisfactory, and this is in line with the sexual profile we have adumbrated above. Napoleon liked his women experienced, and in addition, deflowering a virgin would have brought him uncomfortable reminders of Desiree at a time when he had already admitted, in his letter to Joseph, that he might have made a mistake in his treatment of her. There has always been a persistent rumor that in Egypt Napoleon allowed himself his one and only homosexual encounter, on the Voltairean prescription of once a philosopher, twice a pervert. Allegedly he agreed to experiment because it was put to him that all great conquerors, such as Caesar and Alexander, made a point of tasting forbidden fruit. But it is interesting that this tradition also holds that the encounter was unsuccessful. This surely indicates that the idea of Napoleon's bisexuality, much trumpeted since Sir Richard Burton popularized it in his notes to his translation of the Arabian Nights, is not really convincing. It is true that Napoleon had distinct traces of bisexuality in his psychic makeup, but this is very different from saying that he was bisexual in an active sense. Whatever the unconscious impulses, the conscious Napoleon disliked any suggestion of sexual deviancy, and punished the Marquis de Sade accordingly. On the other hand, he cannot have been unaware that homosexual practices were rampant in any army deprived of women. This was a germane consideration on the Egyptian expedition, for officers and men had been expressly forbidden to take wives, mistresses or girlfriends with them. Many blatantly defied the prescription and dressed their women as men to embark at Toulon. Once safely at sea, an Epicene army appeared, with large numbers of the soldiers proving to be females in disguise. Among those who came to Egypt in this way was the 20-year-old blue-eyed blonde Pauline Fors from Carcassonne. She and her husband were considered by undiscriminating judges to be an ideal couple, but when Napoleon met her on the 30th of November, she soon made it clear she had no objections to becoming his mistress. Yet first there was a serious contretemps which once again showed Junot to be a master of the gaffe. After the initial meeting in a public garden in Cairo, when smoldering eyes and other obvious body language made it clear to Pauline that the Generalissimo wanted her, Napoleon dispatched Lieutenant Fors away on a trumped-up errand and then sent Junot to Pauline as his ambassador of love. Junot, an earthy sensualist, botched the mission by making the proposition in terms of extreme crudity. Pauline replied with affronted dignity that she would always remain faithful to her husband. Napoleon's anger with Junot when he heard the outcome was overdetermined. By an obvious association of ideas he linked Junot's lack of discretion over Josephine, and Hippolyte Charles with this further instance of gross insensitivity on sexual matters. It seems quite clear that Napoleon never forgot the two linked incidents, for when Marshall's batons were handed out to old friends 6 years later, Junot's name was conspicuously absent. For the repeat overture, Napoleon put his trust in the faithful Michel Duroc, with whom he sent not just his apology for Junot's behavior, but the gift of an Egyptian bracelet studded with precious stones and diamonds. Duroc performed his task well, though we may take leave to doubt the story that he called every day for 2 weeks with a different present. In a comic opera subterfuge that can scarcely have fooled Pauline, she was invited to dine on the 19th of December with General Dupuy, the military commandant of Cairo. As the coffee was being served, Napoleon burst into the room and accidentally tipped a cup of the liquid over her dress. He departed with her into Dupuy's private suite to remove the stains. It was 2 hours before the couple emerged. At least this is the story. Napoleon's strategy for getting the lady into the bedroom sounds like the kind of ploy used by a cad from the 1942 rather than the action of a great conqueror, but the circumstantial detail about the coffee cup rings true. The latent hostility a misogynist like Bonaparte would have felt because Pauline kept him waiting before succumbing to his overtures may well have found expression in just this way. It is well known that a favorite form of aggression by men who do not really like women is to try to impair their beauty, or that of their clothes. By all accounts, Pauline was extremely pretty and very accomplished at lovemaking. Napoleon's next task was to get rid of the inconvenient husband. He sent him to France with dispatches, but the troublesome Fours wanted to take his wife with him and was only prevented from doing so by an express order. Laura Abrantz, who had the story from Junot, reported that she said goodbye to her husband with one eye streaming with tears and the other wet with laughter, and that, after going to bed with her husband for a farewell marital embrace, she buttered the bun by going straight to Napoleon's quarters and spending the night with him. It is clear that Pauline's charms had affected the great leader, for he sent orders to Admiral Villeneuve at Malta to provide a warship to convey Fours to Paris. Dalliance with Le Fours was evidently worth the sacrifice of a man-o'-war. But now came a case of history repeating itself, the first time as comedy, the second as farce, just as Junot had been mixed up in both the case of Josephine's infidelity and the tryst with Pauline, so the British lent a hand in both cases to make life difficult for Bonaparte. Scarcely had the dispatch boat Le Chasseur cleared from Alexandria, than it was captured by the Royal Navy vessel Lion. The British, who had an excellent spy network in Cairo, had already heard the gossip about Napoleon and his new mistress and saw a chance to make mischief. The captain of the Lion put Fours ashore near Alexandria, after securing his parole not to serve against England for the duration of the war. Fours arrived in Alexandria and insisted on pressing on for Cairo, despite the exhortations of Marmont, the commandant on the coast, that he should remain there pending further orders. Marmont foresaw a damaging scandal but was uncertain on his ground and weakly let the lieutenant proceed. When he reached Cairo a week later, he was at once informed by his messmates that Pauline was openly living with Bonaparte. He burst into the palace, found her in the bath and whipped her severely, drawing blood. Hearing the outcry, her servants rushed in and threw the husband out. Napoleon then ordered a military court to dismiss Fours the service for conduct unbecoming, and urged Pauline to divorce him, and she agreed. Her husband had destroyed the last vestiges of her affection for him by his brutality. Thereafter Pauline was seen everywhere on Napoleon's arm. The troops called her Cleopatra, which accurately suggested that her hold on the leader was wholly sexual. As usual in such cases, the affair began to peter out once the first flames of passion were doused. In the end, Napoleon grew tired of her and did not take her back to France with him in August 1, 799. She became General Kleber's mistress, which irrationally annoyed the dog-in-the-manger Bonaparte, but was soon discontented and yearned to return to France. Grudgingly, Kleber allowed her to depart for Rosetta and the north coast where, while waiting to take ship to France, she succumbed to the predatory Junot, always a man with an eye to the main chance where women were concerned. In Marseille she was detained for some time in a quarantine hospital, and when she eventually reached Paris, Napoleon had her pensioned off and married to Count Henry de Rothschild. Napoleon always had a sentimental streak when it came to his former mistresses. Josephine meanwhile was matching infidelity with infidelity. According to Barras, when she received a false report that her husband had been killed in Egypt, she burst out laughing, jumped for joy and told Barras how glad she was that cruel egoist was dead. She even contemplated divorcing her absent husband and marrying Hippolyte Charles. It was said that Louis Goyer, the new president of the Directory, encouraged her in this ambition, hoping that he in turn could become her lover, but both Charles and Barras cautioned against the idea. In yet another melancholy twist of the Ronde d'Amour, Desiree in 1798 took as her husband none other than Napoleon's bitterest enemy Jean Bernadotte. The idyll with Napoleon IV came to an abrupt end on the 10th of February 1799 when Napoleon left Cairo for Syria. He had received intelligence that the Turks planned a two-pronged attack, with their so-called army of roads being ferried across the Aegean by Napoleon's old opponent Commodore Sir William Sidney Smith, while a separate army of Damascus advanced on eastern Egypt via Palestine and Sinai. Napoleon's strategy was to avoid being caught between two fires, leaving a token force to control Egypt. He intended to march to Palestine, seize the fortress of Acre, defeat the Damascus army, and then double back to meet the army of Rhodes. For the invasion of Syria he relied on 3,000 infantry, 900 cavalry and some 50 big guns. A garrison of barely S0 was left in Cairo. The march across the arid Sinai desert was grueling, even in winter, and the army had to slaughter many of its mules and camels to survive. Entry into the lemon and olive groves of the Gaza plain promised better things, but there was a disappointment in the unexpectedly strong resistance of the fortress of El Arish. The defenders repelled several frontal attacks before Napoleon forced a surrender on the 19th of February by opening a formal siege. Together with the unintended consequences of the siege, Napoleon calculated that the delay at El Arish had cost him 11 days, it turned out, which he could ill afford and which affected the outcome of the entire campaign. Perhaps the frustration at El Arish was one factor in the obscene butchery Napoleon ordered at Jaffa 2 weeks later. Gaza fell on the 25th of February, yielding 2,000 prisoners, and by the 3rd of March the French army was at the gates of Jaffa. The 3,000 defenders here accepted the word of a French officer that their lives would be spared if they surrendered. But once in possession of the city, Napoleon ordered them all executed, plus about 400 of the prisoners taken at Gaza. This mass slaughter was by any standards a war crime, but it reached a fresh dimension of horror in the way it was carried out. Anxious to save bullets and gunpowder, Napoleon ordered his men to bayonet or drown the condemned thousands. The resulting Holocaust revolted hardened veterans who thought they already knew about atrocities. There are well-authenticated reports of soldiers wading out to sea to finish off terrified women and children who preferred to take their chances with the sharks. This dreadful massacre was one of several incidents that haunted Napoleon ever afterwards, not in the sense that he felt guilty. He did not, but because he realized posterity would judge him harshly unless he could plead compelling necessity. He and his supporters have mounted several lines of defense, some specious, some with a certain ad hoc force, but none convincing. The argument that his aides were not authorized to accept a Turkish surrender is casuistry. Not much better is the two-quote proposition that the defenders of Jaffa had killed a French herald who approached under a flag of truce, and that in Acre the ferocious Turkish commander Cesar Pasha had announced he would behead any French prisoners. If Napoleon had come to Egypt to civilize, as he claimed, this rejoinder was not really open to him. More compelling is the defense that he had barely enough food to feed his own army, would therefore have to release the prisoners to fend for themselves, and would thus risk having Acre reinforced by men to whom a word of honor meant nothing. It is known that he was particularly enraged to find that most of the Gaza prisoners, who had been released on parole, had simply gone on to fight at Jaffa. Perhaps Napoleon genuinely thought that military ends justified any means. Perhaps he was supremely ruthless and wanted to give his enemies convincing proof of his awesome qualities. The issue, in a word, was credibility. Or perhaps he considered that Arabs and Turks were lesser breeds without the law, and that atrocities visited on them did not thereby legitimate war crimes when two European nations were locked in combat. The issue of atrocities in the Napoleonic Wars is a complex one, but it must be conceded that Napoleon was the first one to set foot down that gruesome road. On the other hand, it is true that the Turks habitually used massacre to cow their enemies, that they recognized no rules of war, and that, as in Spain later, the British made no attempt whatever to dissuade their hosts and allies from frightful atrocities against French prisoners. As if the massacre was a sin crying to heaven for vengeance and heaven had answered, the French army was immediately struck by plague and had to stay a week at Jaffa. Morale plummeted, and Napoleon decided he had to assert his role as thaumaturge and inspired leader. He followed one of the darkest episodes in his life by one of the most courageous by visiting the hospital where his plague-stricken men lay dying. Fearlessly he touched the expiring men and helped to carry out a corpse. Always Shavian in his attitude to illness and doctors, he assured his petrified officers that willpower was everything and that the right mental attitude could overcome plague. This is one of the great moments in Napoleonic iconography. Gros's painting Napoleon visiting the plague victims of Jaffa portrays the leader as a Christ-like figure, but the effect on morale of his courage was real enough at the time. By the end of March he was able to resume the march on Acre, even though he left 300 plague cases behind. The fates were not smiling on the Syrian campaign, for the delays at El Arish and Jaffa effectively precluded a successful conclusion. If Napoleon had arrived at Acre any time before his march, he could simply have walked into the city. But meanwhile two things happened. On his march Sir Sidney Smith appeared off Acre in the Royal Navy ships Tiger and Theseus, just in time to prevent Djezzar Pasha evacuating the town. Smith had faced Napoleon at Toulon, but, in an even more bizarre turn of events, he brought with him the very same Philippox, now an émigré officer of engineers, who had once been Napoleon's classmate at the Paris Military Academy. Smith at once landed some companies of British troops, while Philippox put Acre in a sound state of defense. Even so, Napoleon might still have prevailed had not British naval power once more tilted the odds. His flotilla bearing most of his siege guns was intercepted by the Royal Navy off Mount Carmel, with the consequence that when the French assaulted Acre they came under fire from their own artillery. With proper siege guns Napoleon could have blown Acre apart, but without them he was reduced to slow sapping and mining or costly frontal assaults on prepared positions. Smith concentrated his fire on the French trenches, making good use of the lighthouse mole and being supported by broadsides from Theseus and Tiger. All the time fresh supplies reached Acre, while in the French lines the sick list continued to grow. Morale was not aided by the news that Djezzar Pasha was paying a large bounty for every infidel head brought to him. Operations went into temporary abeyance in the first week of April at word of the approach of the army of Damascus. Once contact was made with the enemy, the French won all the early rounds. On the 8th of April an outnumbered Junot was the victor in a cavalry skirmish near Nazareth, while on April Kleber with Sumen routed 6,000 Turks in a more substantial battle at Canaan. In yet another engagement the dashing cavalry leader Joachim Murat crossed the Jordan to the north of Lake Tiberia, and defeated 0 Turks. Emboldened by these easy successes, on 6 April Kleber with just 2,000 men attempted a surprise dawn attack on the entire 0 strong army of Damascus as it lay unsuspecting in its tents. Not surprisingly, the attack failed and soon the French had their backs to the wall, in a desperate position under Mount Tabor, with stocks of ammunition running low. They formed square and prepared to sell their lives dearly. Suddenly, at about 4 p.m. Napoleon appeared, having made a forced march from Acre. A devastating barrage from his cannon and some well-aimed volleys from his advancing squares panicked the Turks, who had seen what just 2,000 Frenchmen could do and were terrified at the thought of being caught between the two armies. The retreat became a rout, and soon the threat from the army of Damascus was no more. Amazingly, Kleber's army, which had fought all day, had lost just 2 killed and 60 wounded in a 10-hour battle with 25,000 horsemen. If everything had gone right against the army of Damascus, at Acre everything was still going wrong. When, on the 1st of April, the French sappers exploded a large mine under the tower of the damned guarding the city, against all predictions it failed to crack the masonry and provide the breach needed. In a frontal assault Napoleon narrowly escaped death from an exploding shell through the quick action of his personal bodyguard, the guides. There was a shortage of food and essential material, also of ammunition and cannonballs. Even when the rest of the siege artillery arrived safely at Jaffa, and Napoleon was able to bring big guns to bear on Acre, he still could not take the city. Then plague broke out again, with 270 new cases by the end of April. On his return from Mount Tabor Napoleon ordered a series of desperate frontal assaults. For the first 10 days of May the tide of battle ebbed and flowed with fury. On the 8th of May Lannes actually breached the defenses and got inside the fort, sustaining serious wounds in the process, only to find himself confronted with a second line of defense, even more formidable. One of his generals, it may have been the irrepressible Junot, remarked that Turks were inside and Europeans outside, yet they were attacking Turkish style of fortress defended European style. Reluctantly Napoleon concluded that the citadel, continually reinforced by sea and with fresh forces pouring in daily from Rhodes, could never be taken. He had no option but to raise the siege. 63 days of investment and 8 costly all-out attacks had all been for nothing. This was the first serious setback in Bonaparte's military career. In the 3 months fighting so far the French had lost 4,500 casualties from an army of 0. 4 generals had perished outside Acre: Bonne, Caffarelli, Damartin and Rambaud. Napoleon failed at Acre partly through bad luck and partly through miscalculation. First he lost half his 24-pounders to the Royal Navy, then he failed to equip his other guns adequately. He had allowed only 200 rounds per 24-pounder and 300 shells per mortar, when he needed twice the quantity of shells and 5 times the rounds. Most of all, he had calculated that Acre would surrender without a fight, which of course it would have done had he not been delayed at Iwan Arish and Jaffa. Moreover, if the usually reliable Frank, Ois Bernoyer is to be believed, some of Bonaparte's generals, notably Damartin, worried that victory at Acre would lead Napoleon to march on Persia and India, actively conspired to prevent its fall. Furious at the blow to his prestige, Napoleon set his propaganda machine to work to mask the defeat by dwelling on the glorious victory at Mount Tabor. But his fury found expression in the public humiliation and foul-mouthed abuse of the 69th Regiment, which had failed in the final assault. He announced that until such time as the regiment retrieved its laurels he refused to acknowledge its existence. Napoleon now prepared for a hazardous retreat, anxious lest the emboldened enemy dog his footsteps across the desert. Exactly what happened in fact. A particular problem was the 2,300 men wounded or on the sick list. If he tried to take them with him, his already seriously depleted army would not be able to march fast enough to elude pursuers, and the result might well be a form of death by 1,000 cuts, with daily attacks on the rearguard gradually nibbling away at the strength of his effectives. On the other hand, if the sick and wounded were left behind, they would be beheaded and otherwise mutilated by the Turks. To his chief of medical staff Dr. Desgenais, Napoleon suggested a simple solution: euthanasia of the worst cases by opium. Desgenais refused, but, to sugar the pill, experimented by giving 30 plague-stricken victims laudanum, in some cases with beneficial effects. Reluctantly, the troops man-hauled the rest of them back to Jaffa, while Napoleon covered the operation by continuing to bombard Acre until the 20th of May, using up all the siege gun ammunition thereby. He then spiked the big guns, leaving himself with just 40 pieces of field artillery. In Jaffa, where the French paused 4 days, a final decision about the fate of the sick and wounded could no longer be postponed, especially since the occupants of the hospital where Napoleon had visited the plague victims on II March simply swelled the throng of non-combatants. After desperate attempts to evacuate all military hospitals had proved unavailing, a threefold strategy was adopted. On all the hopeless cases, mercy killing was used. Those who were on the mend but could not yet be moved were left to the mercy of the Turks. Walking wounded and convalescent were mounted on horses and mules. For the euthanasia, Napoleon has of course been much criticized, but this was a different case from the massacre of the Turks, and it is difficult to see what realistic option he had, especially since the incoming Turks did behave to the abandoned Frenchmen in line with the worst possible predictions. It was a gloomy and demoralized French army that trekked back to Gaza. But the real nightmare came next, in the shape of a 4-day crossing of the Sinai Desert. This had been an ordeal even during winter on the outward march, but now, sweltering in temperatures that rose as high as 54 degrees C, with food and water low, a long train of wounded and a mounting casualty list, and Turkish horsemen harassing their rear, the French experienced exquisite torment and came close to outright mutiny. Finally, on the 3rd of June, the exhausted survivors traipsed into Acacia, with its ample supplies of food and water. The Syrian campaign, in some ways a miniature forerunner of Rate R2, had achieved nothing, except possibly to delay the Turkish landing at Alexandria while reinforcements were sent to Acre. Casualties had been terrific, and even Bonaparte's formidable propaganda machine was hard put to it to talk up the doomed campaign as a glittering success. Defiantly, Napoleon staged a triumph in Cairo on I-4 June as he re-entered the city. The one thing he did have to celebrate was the quite extraordinary military achievement of Dessalines in Upper Egypt. Although seemingly engaged in a Sisyphean task of pacification, in that each conquered area rose in revolt as soon as Dessalines moved on and Murad Bey continued to receive reinforcements from Arabia. Dessalines never relaxed his grip in a remorseless war of attrition. He won 3 great battles, at El Lakan on the 7th of October 1798, Samhud on the 22nd of January 1799 and at Abnud on the 8th of March. In the end, Murad and the Mamelukes cracked under the strain of continuous campaigning. Dessalines' campaign concluded triumphantly just when Napoleon was emerging from Syria. The French general Belliard captured the Red Sea port of Koster on the 29th of May, thus driving a wedge between the two hostile armies and preventing Murad from linking up with his allies in Syria. Yet the impossibility of holding Egypt in subjection, marooned as he was and without hope of reinforcement from France, must have struck Napoleon forcibly when he heard that in addition to Dessalines' ceaseless endeavors there had been 2 large-scale revolts in the Nile Delta during his absence, one led by the Emir el-Hajj Mustafa and the other, a more serious outbreak headed by a fanatic claiming to be the Angel B. Modi of the Quran or, in some versions, the Mahdi or Promised One. General Dessalines proceeded to Lannis, defeated el-Modi and his army, then executed 500 ringleaders including the Mahdi himself. Yet all these successful French campaigns entailed losses in manpower Napoleon could ill afford, and there continued to be isolated massacres and ambushes of his troops. It was therefore immediately on his return to Cairo that Napoleon began to think seriously about how to return to France. The usual version is that it was only after Sidney Smith, in an obvious bout of psychological warfare, allowed French ships to deliver newspapers with news of the Directory's disastrous setbacks in I-798-99, that Napoleon decided to leave Egypt. In fact, some individual French spies managed to get to Egypt with news, and it would indeed be surprising if Napoleon had genuinely been without all intelligence for almost an entire year. After all, the interests of too many people, from Joseph to Barras, depended on keeping Bonaparte fully informed. First, though, he had to pacify Egypt. To cow internal opposition, he organized the show trials of 32 members of the Cairo elite whom he suspected of treachery, and, after having them convicted on trumped-up charges, executed them during I-9 the 22nd of June. his propaganda machine got to work, exaggerating his successes everywhere, and threatening dire retribution if the army of Rhodes dared land at Alexandria. To boost the morale of his men, he claimed that bubonic plague was only contracted by men who already had a death wish, and that there was nothing to fear from the disease. But when Napoleon tried to force Dr. Desgenets to make a public declaration that the plague was not contagious, Desgenets protested he could not be party to such a blatant lie. At this, Napoleon exploded with rage, and a violent altercation took place between him and Desgenets. Angrily, Napoleon accused the doctor, "You're all the same with your principles, you teachers, doctors, surgeons, chemists, the whole pack of you. Rather than sacrifice one of your precious principles, you'd let an entire army perish, yes, even an entire society." The blow Napoleon had long been expecting fell on July, when Sidney Smith's fleet escorted Turkish landing craft into Aboukir Bay and disembarked 5,000 troops. The French garrison at Aboukir under Marmont valiantly held out until 8 July, giving Napoleon his chance to strike at the aging commander Mustafa Pasha. But Napoleon was supremely ungrateful for their sacrifice. He claimed to have given orders for razing the town of Aboukir and fortifying the citadel, which Marmont had not carried out. When 300 defenders and 100 elite fighters in the citadel finally surrendered, having bought valuable time, Napoleon simply raged about their perfidy and cowardice. Napoleon headed north from Cairo on forced marches, together with Lannes, Bonn and their corps. Desaix was urgently recalled from Upper Egypt. The worst anxiety for Bonaparte was that, while he was engaged in the north, a new Turkish army might advance on Cairo from Syria. But a planned Turkish pincer movement foundered on the incompetence of Murad Bey. Murad was supposed to advance to Alexandria, bringing thousands of horses to mount the Turkish host and draw the big guns. Murad, however, got no farther than the pyramids before he was chased ignominiously back into the desert by Murat. Napoleon arrived at Alexandria with 6,000 men, fully aware that it would take another fortnight for the other French corps, 10,000 strong under Kleber, to arrive. Learning that the Turks had not yet disembarked any cavalry or big guns, he decided to make a lightning strike with his own 1,000-strong cavalry. The maneuver was perilous but plausible, since the enemy, by stationing its wings on high ground, had left a weak spot in the center. There were 3 successive lines of Turkish entrenchments to be carried, and at first it was Napoleon's intention simply to force the enemy back to their second line of defense, where he could pin them with howitzers and shells from artillery swiftly brought up to the abandoned first line. Outnumbered 2-1, the French performed miracles. Murat's dashing cavalry attack through the center, supported by Lannes on the left and D'Estaing on the right, cut the Turkish army in two. The ill-disciplined Janissaries played into French hands by leaving their defenses in search of French heads. The Turks abandoned the first line of defense and rushed back to the second, but Murat's cavalry got between the two lines, forcing the Turkish right into the sea and the left into Lake Mahdi. Meanwhile, Lannes and D'Estaing on the wings had taken the high ground and came on at the double. It was estimated that thousands of panic-stricken Turks drowned at this point. Encouraged by this easy success, Napoleon increased the stakes and gambled that he could take the third line of defense as well. Observing that Lannes was likely to turn his left, the enemy commander Mustafa Pasha sortied from the entrenchment with 0 men. There was a short and ferocious struggle, during which Murat and Mustafa actually fought each other from horseback and Murat took a wound in the cheek. Now Napoleon showed his genius for timing by throwing in the reserve at exactly the right moment to reinforce the struggling Lannes. The outflanking movement was completed and Lannes was in the rear of the redoubt. When D'Estaing came charging in, the despondency and terror of the Turkish defenders was total. Most of them fled in disarray and a further 3,000 were driven into the sea. Mustafa himself and his reserve of 500 Janissaries were surrounded and taken prisoner. By 4 p.m. only 4,000 Turkish effectives remained on the field, and they barricaded themselves in the town and citadel of Aboukir, which they had taken with such difficulty just a week before. Not wishing to suffer further losses in house-to-house fighting, Napoleon brought up his heavy artillery for a final period of slaughter. It was a notable French victory, one of the few occasions when Napoleon actually carried out his textbook destruction of an enemy. For a loss of 220 killed and 750 wounded, he had defeated an army between twice and 3 times as large. Turkish losses amounted to at least 5,000 dead. The 69th Regiment, publicly humiliated at Acre for its allegedly poor showing, and condemned to the task of escorting the sick on the retreat across the Sinai Desert, fought with a desperate tenacity and fully retrieved their laurels. Sidney Smith, who had confidently selected Mustafa's defensive positions and advised him on the choice of ground, was lucky to escape back to his sloop. Back in Cairo, Napoleon could now make leisurely plans for the departure, which he had strongly hinted at as early as 2 June, when he asked Admiral Ganteaume to be ready to sail for Europe in the frigates Le Murin and Le Carrière. To put pressure on the Directory to recall him, he sent a dispatch to Paris on the 29th of June, acknowledging the loss of 5,344 men, and asking for 6,000 reinforcements, knowing very well that they would not be forthcoming. Whether the political situation in France meant that the fruit was finally ready for the picking he knew not, and there was grave risk of interception by the Royal Navy, as he traveled virtually the entire breadth of the Mediterranean. But his own future demanded that he get out of Egypt as soon as possible. On the 11th of August, a fresh sheaf of newspapers arrived in Cairo, leaving no doubt of the scale of disaster in Europe. At last the worst was widely known, that France faced a coalition of England, Austria, Russia, Turkey and Naples, that the Russians seemed ubiquitous in Europe, that an Anglo-Russian army had invaded Holland and an Austro-Russian army had gained control of Switzerland, that a Turco-Russian fleet had captured Corfu, and that another Austro-Russian army had swept into northern Italy and undone all Bonaparte's work there in a matter of weeks. France was reported to be on the verge of economic collapse and royalist sentiment was running high. Napoleon knew all this already, but in a carefully stage-managed histrionic outburst put on for the benefit of his generals, he rehearsed the scale of the disaster in Europe. France facing Austria on the Rhine, Austrians and Russians in northern Italy and Neapolitans and Sicilians in the south, Austrian victories at Stockach on the Rhine and at Magnano, and Cassano in Italy, R8-0 British troops and I-8,000 Russian dominating Holland, Neapolitans entering Rome, the Russians in Turin, the Austrians in Milan, and with all the Royal Navy still the master of the Mediterranean. He invade against the directors. Can it be true? Poor France. What have they done, the idiots? He put it to the assembled company that he wanted to stay with them but now had no choice. It was fortunate for him that on the 26th of May the directors had sent him a dispatch authorizing him to evacuate if he thought it necessary. This precious document would later give him a tenuous ex post facto justification for his decision to cut and run. What Napoleon did not tell his generals was that he was deeply disturbed by a strong rumor that in Paris Sieyes was trying to engineer a coup and had called in General Joubert as his sword. On the 17th of August, Admiral Ganteaume informed his leader that the Anglo-Turkish fleet had left Egyptian waters. This was the chance Napoleon was waiting for. On the 17th of August he left Cairo for the coast and 6 days later put to sea in the Muirin. He took just a handful of his favorites and most trusted personnel with him. Of the savants, only Monge and Berthelot were allowed to accompany him. Of the generals, only Berthier, Lannes and Murat made the journey. Marmont, Bessières, Duroc, Eugene de Beauharnais, Burian, the newly acquired Mameluke servant Roustam and 200 guides were among the favored few. Notable for her absence was Paulin Fors. Command devolved on Kleber, who later claimed he had been presented with a fait accompli, and knew of Bonaparte's departure only after he had gone. Choking back the fury he felt, Kleber read to his troops the brief communiqué Napoleon had left. Extraordinary circumstances alone have persuaded me, in the interests of my country and its glory and of obedience, to pass through the enemy lines and return to Europe. And his instructions to Kleber, which included the order to send Desaix back to France in November, Napoleon claimed that he would move heaven and earth to reinforce the army in Egypt. The arrival of our Brest squadron at Toulon and of the Spanish squadron at Cartagena leaves no doubt as to the possibility of transporting to Egypt the muskets, sabres, pistols and ammunition of which you and I have an exact list, together with enough recruits to make good the losses of 2 campaigns. You can appreciate how important the possession of Egypt is for France. He also authorized Kleber, in the event that no reinforcements arrived by May 1, 800, or if plague cut a swath through the army, to conclude a peace with Turkey, even if this meant evacuating Egypt. But he thought the most likely outcome was that the future of Egypt would be subsumed in a general European peace treaty. Did Napoleon simply abandon the French army in Egypt to its fate, in the full and cynical knowledge that Egypt was a lost cause? Kleber certainly thought so. After he had read the instructions he told his brother officers, "He's left us with his breeches full of shit. We'll go back to Europe and rub it in his face." Technically, Napoleon was within his rights, since the letter from the Directory authorized him to return with or without his army, and it must be pointed out that he sent Ganteaume back several times with a force of S-0 reinforcements, but on each occasion the admiral was unable to make landfall. The fact that Napoleon was unlikely to achieve much in Egypt and was needed more urgently in Europe is irrelevant to the argument, since this was already the case when he left France in May 1798. An honorable general would have stayed with his men and taken his chances, even if it meant capitulating with them. But Napoleon did not work from moral principles and despised notions like honor if they could not be yoked to his self-interest. A man who would remain with his army in Egypt in the context of August 1799 was not the stuff of which a future emperor was made. The sequel in Egypt is easily told. As soon as Napoleon left, Kleber disregarded his instructions and contacted Sidney Smith to act as mediator between France and Turkey. By the Treaty of El Arish of the 13th of January 1800, Kleber agreed to leave Cairo within 40 days for Alexandria, where he and the French army would be given safe conduct back to France. but the hardline Pitt in London refused to countenance any terms but unconditional surrender. 2 more years had to elapse and many more battles were fought before there was an end of bloodshed in the desert. It was not just Napoleon who was careless of human life in this epoch. Kleber, with just 10,000 men, won a spectacular victory against yet another invading Turkish army at Heliopolis on the 20th of March 1800. In December that year he was assassinated by a Moslem fanatic and succeeded by the lackluster General Menu, the only Frenchman in Egypt who actually converted to Islam. Faced by what seemed to be a permanent French colony astride British trade routes to the Orient, the government in London decided in October 1, 800 by a bare majority to send General Abercrombie to reconquer Egypt. The landing in Aboukir Bay in March 1, 801 was bitterly contested, but ultimately successful. 2 weeks later a night battle was fought at Aboukir, which the British won. The French General Belliard cravenly surrendered the 10,000-strong French garrison in Cairo in June, and after a protracted campaign Menu capitulated at Alexandria in September with his remaining 7,300 effectives. Gantoum, heading yet another French relieving expedition, reached Derna in Libya, 400 miles west of Alexandria, but was forced to turn back. In October the men who surrendered and their dependents arrived back in France. Among them was Pauline Fors, who was met off the ship by Duroc, who forbade her access to Napoleon but pensioned her off with the gift of a country mansion. What did Napoleon achieve in his 14 months in Egypt? From the viewpoint of immediate French interests, almost nothing. Nearly 40,000 troops, many of them elite units, who would have been better employed on the battlefields of Europe, were gradually diminished in numbers by endless and ultimately pointless battles against Mamelukes and Turks. By aiming at Malta he brought the Russians into the Mediterranean ambit, and by striking at Egypt he brought the Royal Navy back into the Levantine seas. It is not too much to say that the Egyptian adventure uniquely allowed the Turks and Russians, those traditional enemies, for once to make common cause. Even if Napoleon had not failed beneath the walls of Acre, it is difficult to see what the end result could have been. The idea of a link-up with Tipu Sahib and the Mysore's was dealt a death blow by the great victory at Seringapatam by General Harris and the Wellesley brothers in the spring of I-799. French losses in battle and from disease were high, and were not compensated by hordes of loot, as in Italy, since there was no way to transport looted artifacts back to France. A few privileged members of the officer class doubtless enjoyed a degree of sexual freedom they could not have had in France. Only long-term and indirectly, in the shape of a burgeoning European intellectual interest in Egyptian history and culture, can one see benefits from the 3-year sojourn of the French. For Napoleon himself it was a different matter. By the time his propaganda machine had winnowed the details of the military campaigns, his very real martial achievements in Egypt had been apotheosized. He himself throve in Egypt and, even if we accept that his diet was immeasurably superior to that of his men, it is surely significant that he remained untouched by plague. His health in fact was never better than during 1798–99. He rid himself of all ailments for a time, only to find them returning when he got back to Europe. He loved the sights, sounds and smells of the Arab world and felt an instinctive sympathy for the culture of the Arabs, and the folkways of the sheikhs and fellahin. He told Madame Remusat that he loved aping Alexander the Great by putting on Eastern garb, and that the East appealed uniquely to his sensibility. In Egypt I found myself freed from the obstacles of an irksome civilization. I was full of dreams. I saw myself founding a religion, marching into Asia, riding an elephant, a turban on my head and in my hand a new Quran that I would have composed to suit my needs. In my undertaking I would have combined the experience of two worlds, exploiting for my own benefit the theater of all history, attacking the power of England and India. The time I spent in Egypt was the most delightful of my life because it was the most ideal. Napoleon's ease with Islamic culture is worth stressing. He understood the mindset of the Arabs extremely well. When the Bedouin raided a village friendly to the French and killed a fellah, he sent 300 horsemen and 200 dromedaries to apprehend and punish the culprits. The Sheikh B. Modi, who witnessed Napoleon's anger and heard his orders, said with a laugh, "Was this fellah thy cousin, that his death excites so much anger in thee?" "Yes," replied Bonaparte. "All whom I command are my children." "Tabe," said the Sheikh, "that is spoken like the Prophet himself." We may discount Freud's fanciful notion that Napoleon, with a brother complex, reveled in Egypt because it was, in a biblical sense, the land of Joseph. But that he had a genuine Oriental complex is hard to deny. However, it must be understood that this was a purely romantic fantasy. Some incautious biographers have speculated that on this campaign he imbibed the spirit of Oriental despotism from the soil, so to speak, and that this explains a new Napoleon, as evinced by the massacre at Jaffa, the judicial murders in Cairo, the plan to poison the sick with opiates and the dubious Machiavellian justification of his return to France. But it is a misreading of Bonaparte to speculate that the man who returned from Egypt was not the man who set out. Probably as early as the initial victories in Italy, Napoleon harbored a yearning for supreme power. Nothing experienced in Egypt affected the lust for power, but Napoleon returned from the East even more clear-headed about how to achieve it.